Here are 6 things that I've learned from reading the code for Baldur's Gate 3. Right off the bat, we'll start with something very weird. Playing the violin counts as an attack. That probably sounds ridiculous, so let me prove it to you. First, I'll take 6 levels of Barbarian, picking Wild Heart for my subclass. At level 6, I'll choose Wolverine for my aspect of the beast. The Wolverine aspect states that anytime you attack a bleeding or poisoned creature, you inflict the maimed condition on them, which sets their movement speed to 0 and gives them disadvantage on dexterity saves for 1 turn. Next, I'll take 1 level of Bard for proficiency with musical instruments. Finally, I'll eat a rotten banana to poison myself, then I'll click on the Perform button to start playing a tune. And look at that, maimed. So what's going on here? Did Tav just shred a tune that was so metal that he literally broke his own limbs? Well, not exactly. Because Perform isn't the only action that will self-maim if you do it while bleeding or poisoned. In fact, almost all self-targeting abilities will do it. Dash, maimed. Disengage, maimed. Hide, maimed. You get the idea. The reason for this has to do with how the BG3 game engine defines an attack. If we look at the code for Aspect of the Beast Wolverine, we can see the 2 lines of code that cause this behavior. It has a stats functor context of on attack, and for stats functors, it just says apply status, crippled, with 100% chance to apply for 1 turn. Crippled is just the name of the maimed condition in the code. That might sound complicated, but it's very simple. Stats functor context controls when an ability runs. It's the context where the stats functors apply. In this case, they apply on attack, whenever the owner of the passive attacks. But attack here doesn't mean what you think it means. A better word would be target or even just effect. This context applies whenever one of your abilities directly affects any entity in the game. So the tooltip for Aspect of the Wolverine should say, whenever you affect a bleeding or poisoned character with an ability, you apply maim to them. If we look at the self-target abilities I mentioned earlier, we can see that they have a target conditions field that says self. So these abilities affect yourself. Since they affect you, they count as on attack for the purposes of the Wolverine aspect. You're affecting or targeting yourself with an ability. This might sound like a bizarre bit of computer trivia, but it has a lot of implications for how this ability works in practice. You can trigger the maimed condition with all sorts of things that you might not consider to be an attack at all. For example, it triggers from most AoE abilities, like the Thunder AoE from Hammerhaft that triggers whenever you jump. But you have to be careful. It's easy to accidentally hit yourself or your allies with this ability. In fact, just the other day, I saw the AI do this by mistake. In the beach fight in Rivington, one of the Stone Lord thugs, a barbarian, threw a potion at her teammate who was under the effect of crawler mucus. The potion counted as affecting them, and since they were poisoned, they got maimed. As a side note, this is the same definition of attack that causes minor illusion and invoke duplicity to instantly vanish when you target them with anything at all. They have this passive, illusion disappear, with a stats functor context of on attacked or on damaged. So when these contexts are triggered, it runs this functor, kill. So that's why minor illusion will die even if you sneeze on it. Because sneezing, like playing the violin, counts as an attack. Number 2, Owlbear Flight isn't special. The Owlbear Wild Shape ability Crushing Flight can do hundreds of damage if you increase your weight via an enlarge effect and then leap on top of enemies from a great height. But if you look at the code for Crushing Flight, there's nothing in there about dealing damage based on height or weight. All it does is run this function, create explosion, which is basically a helper function that triggers another ability. In this case, the quote-unquote explosion that it triggers is an ability called Projectile Jump Knockdown AoE. This ability just knocks everyone prone in a radius of 3 meters if they fail a strength saving throw. So where does the damage even come from? As it turns out, the crushing damage dealt by Crushing Flight has nothing to do with the ability Crushing Flight and is just a property of the game's weight and collision system. You may have noticed that when you throw something heavy from very high, you'll deal extra damage. The combat log will say something like, so-and-so crushed Astarion, and then show the damage. This is the exact same source of damage for Owlbear's Crushing Flight. Everything with weight and momentum can crush in this game, which means that literally all characters can do Owlbear from the top rope just by jumping. The challenge, though, is lining up your hitbox correctly. You need your character's actual model to collide with another entity during the fall itself in order to deal crushing damage. Most humanoid creatures have a big gap between their character model and the little circle underneath them that controls how much space they occupy. This makes it difficult to line up a jump in such a way that you'll actually collide in midair, but it is possible. Based on my testing, it's a lot easier to crush when you have more than 2 legs. The character models for wild shapes like Owlbear, Spider, and Deep Rothe push up more closely against their collision circle, or even hang over it a little bit, so it's easier to line up a jump where your hitbox will physically collide with the enemy during the jump. Also, to do the really big damage, you need to be huge, in the game sense. Huge creatures have a minimum weight of 10,000 pounds, so they do a ton of crushing damage when they land. Most enlarge effects don't stack, so generally speaking, the only way to become huge is to already be large and then get enlarged via the enlarge spell or an elixir of the Colossus. With these shape and weight constraints in mind, the best crushing character is still a druid, but you don't have to be an owlbear to do it. Personally, I like Deep Rothe. If you enlarge your Rothe character with an elixir of the Colossus, you can do a ton of crushing damage just from jumping. You don't even have to fall very far to do it. The game uses a similar system for crush damage as it does for fall damage. So, if a fall is far enough to deal fall damage, it's also far enough to deal crush damage. Even a fall that only deals 1 fall damage is high enough that an enlarged Rothe will deal over 100 crushing damage. And since Rothe's jump, unlike Owlbear's flight, is just the ordinary jump ability, it interacts with some effects that care about jumping. For example, Monk's Step of the Wind. So, if you use Step of the Wind before wild shaping, you can transform into a Rothe and be able to jump over and over for 1 turn. Number 3. Flying Ghouls use Strength for spellcasting. Every character in Baldur's Gate 3 has a spellcasting stat even if they can't ordinarily cast spells. This includes summons like the skeletons from Animate Dead, or the Celestial Himbo from Planar Ally. But their spellcasting stat isn't listed anywhere in-game, so it would be hard to figure out without looking at the code. When I did start looking at this in the code, I was surprised to see that not all summons use mental stats for their spellcasting ability. The Mephits, for instance, use Dexterity, and 2 summons actually use Strength, the Water Elemental from Conjure Elemental, and the Flying Ghouls from Animate Dead. Strength is an insane stat to have for a spellcasting ability in this game, because of strength elixirs. A popular tactic with the Water Elemental is to give it an elixir of Cloud Giant Strength to give it a very good spell save DC on its Winter's Breath ability. This makes enemies much more likely to slip on the ice, and much more likely to fail their saving throw to become brittle, which applies vulnerability to thunder and bludgeoning damage. Flying Ghouls also use Strength, though the reason for this is a mystery to me. The Paralysis ability on their claws has a fixed DC, so increasing their strength won't affect anything they can ordinarily do. But if you give them items that allow them to cast spells, you can give them an elixir of Cloud Giant Strength to make those spells extremely reliable. The staff Morning Frost is a fun one. It's Gale food, so they can equip it straight off the ground, and then they'll be able to cast Ray of Frost with very high accuracy. My favorite item to give them, though, is the Haraknir Bracers, which let them cast Telekinesis. There's nothing funnier and more satisfying than a flock of flying telekinetic ghouls hurling enemies across the battlefield with a single thought. My current solo honor mode run is all about giving equipment to summons, so check that out if you want to see the telekinetic ghouls in action. Speaking of telekinesis, that gets us to the next item on our list. Number 4. Telekinesis counts as a throw. All abilities in the BG3 code have a spell type field that categorizes them by how they interact with the world. So projectile abilities like Firebolt launch something through the air, and target abilities like Healing Word target somebody directly. One of the stranger spell types is Throw, which covers only a few abilities. These include Throw, obviously, and Improvise Melee Weapon, which is basically just a melee version of Throw, and then a few other abilities that are essentially just variations of those, like the Berserker Barbarian's Enraged Throw. It also includes the spell Telekinesis. That sounds weird, but it makes sense when you think about how Telekinesis actually works. Like Throw and Improvise Melee Weapon, Telekinesis actually takes something in the game world and moves it somewhere else, along an arc that cares about collision. Telekinesis differs from Throw in its range and its angle of effect, and it uses a saving throw rather than an athletics check, but it's a similar principle. The reason this matters is that many effects that interact with the throw action will also function with telekinesis. This includes the Ring of Flinging and the Gloves of Uninhibited Kushigo, for example. Both will add 1d4 damage to telekinesis when you use the spell to fling something or someone at your enemies. Telekinesis also counts as a throw for the purposes of weapons that care about throws. If I telekinetically fling Nirulna, it will deal the Thunder AoE at the spot that it lands, and it will even equip itself to me afterwards. Telekinesis will also trigger the subtle swap ability of the Dark Displacement Gloves, provided that you use the spell to fling a weapon that has the thrown property, like a dagger or a spear. Subtle swap causes you to trade places with anybody that you throw a thrown weapon at, provided they fail a DC 13 dexterity saving throw. And if you throw a weapon at an item, you will automatically swap places with it, provided it takes damage, since items cannot succeed at saving throws. You could use this to teleport into some hard to reach places because telekinesis has such a weird angle of effect. The thing about telekinesis is, it doesn't actually care about the line of effect from your character. It just cares about the line of effect of the thing that you're actually throwing. So you can stand on the other side of a locked door and fling things back and forth without ever opening the door. You can even use this trick to teleport through walls. I only found this a few days ago, so I'm still not sure what the best way to use it is, so if you have any ideas, drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Number 5. Flameblade is crazy with the Acuity gloves. The gloves of Battle Mage's power were bugged since the game's release, but they got a rework for patch 8. Now they grant you +2 arcane acuity whenever you deal damage with a spell or cantrip that uses a weapon. If you've actually played around with these gloves, you've probably noticed that they trigger from all sorts of things that don't fit that description. For example, they trigger when you throw somebody, an interaction that inspired my Tavern Brawler wizard build. The triggers for the gloves are controlled by the aptly named Arcane Acuity Gloves condition, which you can see here. It's essentially just a series of checks to see if the triggering damage was caused by a qualifying damage source, like Booming Blade or a Smite spell. But the check for the level 2 druid spell Flameblade is extremely wonky. Rather than check whether you dealt damage with Flameblade, the function just checks whether Flameblade was your active weapon at the time you dealt the damage. If you didn't know, your active weapons are just whichever weapons your character has out. So if you have your melee weapons out, they're your melee weapons, and if you have your ranged weapons out, they're your ranged weapons. However, since your active weapons don't change when you make a throw, unarmed, or spell attack, the check for the gloves will pass any time you deal damage from one of those methods, provided that you have a Flameblade out when you do. This lets you build Acuity really quickly. If you have a Flameblade equipped, the gloves will give you +2 Acuity from every missile of a magic missile, +2 Acuity from every punch of a flurry of blows, and so on. Note that because of the way the code is written, this interaction only works when you have Flameblade in the main hand, not your offhand. It also only works with the druid version of Flameblade and not the version available to Mephistopheles tieflings, which won't trigger the gloves at all. Number 6. Chain Lightning isn't harmful. In the code for abilities, there's a field called Spell Flags, where Larian keeps track of miscellaneous information. One of these spell flags is called Is Harmful, and it indicates whether the spell is, well, harmful. The most familiar place that this comes up is with the spell Sanctuary. If an effect has the Is Harmful flag, then any entity under the effect of Sanctuary can't be targeted by it. So Cure Wounds is not harmful, so you can target a Sanctuaried enemy with it. Disintegrate, on the other hand, is harmful, so no can do. But Larian was pretty inconsistent in how they applied the Is Harmful flag, so a lot of abilities that seem like they should have the flag don't have it. The most shocking example is Chain Lightning. Get it? Shocking example because... According to the game code, this isn't harmful. It's so bizarre that you might never have noticed it before, but Chain Lightning can target enemies through Sanctuary. This, plus the fact that it bounces to multiple different enemies, makes it the perfect spell for blowing up the Ritual Chanters during the fight with Orin. That's how I fought Orin on my Trickery Cleric Summoner run, except the Chain Lightning was cast by Flying Ghouls equipped with Marco Esh gear. There are a number of damaging spells that similarly lack the Is Harmful flag, even though you'd expect them to have it. The big ones are Blight and Thorn Whip. Both will bypass Sanctuary. Another reason this spell flag matters is because of how combat initiation works in Honor Mode. In Honor Mode, when you initiate combat with certain abilities, on the first round of combat, you won't have the action that you spent to activate that ability. So if I use Booming Blade while hiding, I won't have my action available when combat starts. I still don't fully understand how this effect works in the game code, but as a general rule, abilities with Is Harmful will eat your action when you initiate, and abilities without it will not, although there are some exceptions. But here's an incomplete list of spells that lack the Is Harmful flag that are good for initiating combat. Blight, Thorn Whip, Chain Lightning, Hunger of Hadar, Ice Storm. I'm sure there are others, but those are some of the big ones. In particular, Thorn Whip is great for initiating surprise rounds. If you use Thorn Whip from invisibility, you will consistently trigger surprise, and you will have your action available when combat starts. It's sort of like a budget version of the Assassin's Alacrity ability. You can do this with any of the spells that I mentioned, but Thorn Whip is the only one that's a cantrip. And that's it for today's video. I'm curious what you all thought. Did you know about all of these interactions, or were they all new to you? Let me know in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, please consider hitting that like or subscribe button. This has been Build-a-Barbarian Workshop, and I will talk to you next time.